can see there's already quite a few people with us today, so I will start as more and more people are joining. So hello everyone, thank you all for joining us. I will start by giving a brief background on this event and introduce the great panelists who are here with me today. So my name is Salome Letman. I'm a project and advocacy advisor at Mercy Corps and the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance, and I'll be moderating today's session. We will be discussing a report that was recently published by ODI and the Flood Resilience Alliance on annexed to countries' fair shares of climate finance. This report has been written to really strengthen accountability on climate finance, and it assesses each developed country's progress towards its fair share of the 100 billion target. The report also takes a look at adaptation finance against the commitment to at least double adaptation funding by 2025. So this report has been published at a really critical time with uncontrollable wildfires and heat waves in the south of Europe this summer, Storm Daniel causing devastating flooding in parts of the Mediterranean, further really underlining the need for action, but also increased and improved climate finance. So I am now joined by Koosje van der Loo from the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who will be providing the opening remarks on the importance of international climate finance, but also by Dr. Letizia Pettinotti from ODI, who will present the findings from the report and shed light on who is and is not paying their fair shares of climate and adaptation finance. Colin McKiston from Practical Action will underline the importance of providing better quality of climate finance, but also provide a looking ahead around the next climate finance goal and COP28. He'll then be followed by Jackson McKenna from Concern Worldwide, who will underline the impact that continuous underfunding has for those on the front lines of climate change, and will really focus on Kenya. So we'll do our best to stick to time and open the floor for Q&A session for about 10 minutes at the end of the webinar, where you'll have the opportunity to ask all your questions to the panelists. So please write your questions in the chat and we'll try to answer as many as possible. And without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Koosje, to open the webinar.
Thank you so much, and also thank you for your introduction. It's my pleasure to be here today at this event around the launch of ODI's report on the current state of climate and adaptation finance. And let me start by thanking the Flood Resilience Alliance for organizing this event and the ODI team for their valuable insights, which really help guide and inform the climate policy discussions and climate action. And your efforts will hopefully also spur the mobilization of additional resources and support in the run-up to COP28 and beyond COP28 by feeding into the negotiations on the new collective quantified goal that are currently ongoing and will be culminating at COP29 next year. Meeting the climate finance goals is instrumental in our efforts to combat climate change and to safeguard our planet's future. Without adequate financing, our ambitions to a low carbon and climate resilient global economy will remain elusive. Meeting the climate finance goals is a matter of global solidarity and responsibility. Some of the most vulnerable countries, which have contributed the least to climate change, often bear the brunt of its consequences. As we gather virtually here today, there are billions of people counting on us. People living on floodplains and coastlines, or in areas prone to severe storms. People facing extreme heat stress in big cities, and people who daily struggle to get fresh water or to provide their families with enough to eat. It is clear that the effects of climate change are already with us and will be with us for a long time, even when we succeed in limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. And although some countries are hit harder than others, and some have or have had a bigger share in current emissions, climate change is a global crisis that affects everyone and requires a global solution. To address the challenges we face, we need collaboration at all levels, from the local to the global. An important commodity for collaboration is trust. And that's why it is so important that the 100 billion goal is met. At the same time, we all know, and it is also mentioned in the report, that the 100 billion goal is only a fraction of what is needed to support vulnerable countries to achieve climate goals in accordance with the Paris Agreement. If the mitigation and adaptation goals of the Paris Agreement are to be met, worldwide, much greater investments are needed from numerous sources and channels and from a variety of donors. In the latest UNFCCC analysis of financing needs, developing countries require at least 6 trillion by 2030 to meet less than half of their existing NDCs. And the same goes for adaptation. Adaptation finance is growing slowly, but remains significantly less than needed. According to the UNEP 2022 Adaptation Gap Report, adaptation finance flows to developing countries are 5 to 10 times below needs, and the gap is widening. As the Netherlands, we want to lead by example. We are increasing our climate finance from 1.4 billion euros in 2022 to 1.85 billion euros from 2025 onwards. And as part of this endeavor, we will double adaptation finance and continue to allocate more than half of our public, fully grant-based climate finance to adaptation with a focus on the most vulnerable countries. However, public resources will only get us so far. We need everyone to be on board and join forces: governments, multilateral institutions, development banks, and the private sector. And we need to make sure that all finance flows will be made consistent with the Paris Agreement. Development partners need to put adaptation at par with mitigation. We need to collectively prioritize adaptation and deliver on the commitment to double adaptation finance by 2025. And we all have to involve the private sector, improve the economic incentives for climate resilience investments, and work on the enabling environment. Collaboration is key. In addition, it's not just about more money. It's also about accessibility and quality of the finance provided. Very little finance reaches the local level. We need more climate finance for locally led adaptation to support design, implementation, monitoring, and sustaining of adaptation action on the front lines. The LLA agenda, locally led adaptation agenda, is important to ensure long-term developmental impact, generating solutions that are effective and locally owned and implemented. We really have to make sure that adaptation finance reaches people and communities on the ground, especially the most marginalized groups, such as women, youth, and indigenous peoples. Higher quality adaptation finance also means more decentralized, transparent, patient, and predictable finance, while addressing access and eligibility barriers, including in the international climate funds, such as the GCF and the GEF. Accessibility to climate finance is time-consuming, burdensome, and bureaucratic. This needs to change. And as the Netherlands, we will continue to use the position, for example, in the boards, to put improved access high on the agenda. More in general, and also as one of the co-founders of the Champions Group on Adaptation Finance, the Netherlands remains committed to enable and promote initiatives and solutions to close the adaptation finance gap in order to respond to the growing adaptation needs, while also ensuring the balance with mitigation finance and making sure they are targeted to reach those most in need. As mentioned before, adaptation efforts need to go hand in hand with mitigation. This COP, as we reflect on progress since Paris and determine the areas for enhanced action and support in the global stocktake, we must work together through our shared climate ambition to keep the 1.5 within reach and to make sure we will manage the ever-increasing impacts of climate change in a robust and effective way. To conclude, in the end, it all comes down to the willingness to collaborate. In order to prevent climate finance from being a contentious issue, but rather a way to create a better and more resilient world, there's an urgent need to build trust, to develop a shared understanding of the barriers and challenges around climate finance, and adaptation finance in particular, and to come up with concrete plans and solutions to overcoming these. To build and regain trust, we also need transparency and accountability. The Netherlands, for example, provides a yearly publication of our public climate finance and the mobilized private sector climate finance. But I believe this is quite unique. And that's why ODI's report is so important. So thank you once more, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Coach, and thank you for providing a really useful overview of the situation, but as well for underlining the importance of improving the quality of climate finance and of achieving a balance between adaptation and mitigation finance, which now leads us nicely to Laetitia, who will present the report and provide an overview of who is and is not paying their fair share of climate finance. So, Laetitia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Salome, and hi, everyone. I'm presenting here on behalf of a team at ODI, and I think Crochet has put it very nicely and very brilliantly that at the heart of the 100 billion, there is this issue of trust, and it is critical. Next, please, because as was mentioned earlier, so we have our largely aspirational as per the Paris Agreement, that all financial flows are consistent with climate objectives. And we have this tiny drop, which is the 100 billion, which doesn't match needs, and yet it hasn't been met. So it was supposed to be met in 2020, has been extended up to 2025, and yet developed countries still have not provided the 100 billion. And this is a problem because we do have this infiltrating and permeating all negotiations, this issue of trust, because if developed countries have not provided this 100 billion, how can we continue negotiating and trust that we're all in it together and all working towards the same objectives? And then we also have this, informal sub-goal in a way, around adaptation finance, because historically it has been underfunded. So in 2021, developed countries were urged to at least double their collective provision of adaptation finance by 2025. And so this is the third year that we do this fair share of climate finance report. And the reason why we want to keep pressure and to do it actually every year is really to push on these questions of accountability that Crochet was mentioning, because every single year the target has not been met. And the problem, or one of the problems with the 100 billion, is that it's a collective pledge, and it's the same for the adaptation finance. It's collective, and that means that collectively countries are to meet the target, but that means that there is no mechanism to apportion how much each individual country should be providing. So, for example, and I'm going to pick on the country where I live currently because I feel I'm allowed. But when the UK says we are going to contribute 2 billion more to the GCF replenishment, as was announced a bit earlier this month, well, typically I wonder, but is that enough? Should it be 10 times more? Should it be just twice as much? And so that's what our fair share does, is to provide this benchmarking so that when the UK announces 2 billion more, we can have this reflexive take of, wait a minute, it should actually be 10 times, twice as much. Please, next slide. So I'm going to cover quickly our methodology before presenting findings. Next slide, please. So in order to have this benchmarking and accounting, having this accountability of how much should each country contribute, what we have done is develop an index so that we can attribute the fair share to each developed country. So we have combined together gross national income as a proxy for countries' ability to pay, with cumulative territorial CO2 emissions as a proxy for historical responsibility for a changed climate, with population as a way to, equally attribute responsibility to all people living in developed countries. And so what we have done is use a percentage of each countries to the collective sum of GNI, CO2 emissions and populations, so that we can have this composite index of how much each country should contribute. And so we use the same index for the adaptation finance, but here, instead of 100 billion being the target, we use 40 billion as the target. But here we should note that, and this is why I have pasted here the exact text that was agreed in Glasgow, is because contrary to the 100 billion, this is not a goal, a target per se. That's why I put it in inverted commas, because there is no quantitative target for the adaptation finance. It's to double adaptation finance from 2019 levels. So we've taken how much has been reported to the OECD in 2019 and doubled that amount, and that gets us to 40 billion. But it's just to underline how, when you want to strengthen accountability, the first hurdle actually is how much do we agree to contribute? So this is really a Pandora box. Please, next slide. So for our data set, we use climate-related finance, which is the finance that developed countries report to the OECD. And we use data for 2021. This is because this is the latest data that's available because countries have not reported to the UNFCCC yet for 2021. So we use that data set and compare to previous years. So our one methodological difference is that this year we account for outflows for multilateral finance. So what that means is that there are shareholders to multilateral development banks, to multilateral climate funds, and so MDBs, and to a lesser extent MCF, can actually mobilize finance, greater finance, on their retained earnings or on private markets, so that actually they can make the money go further. So they have shareholders that give inflow into the bank or the fund, and then the outflows are typically greater because MDBs, MCF can mobilize greater finance. So what we have done is reattribute these outflows back to our set of countries. So I go into a bit of detail because it's a way to actually have a more accurate depiction of how much has been provided. Next slide, please, so that we can go to and next, we're moving toward our findings. So this is our league table ranking for 2021. The shortfall is, over 35 billion in 2021, and it would have been greater had not some countries provided, twice as much as their fair share. So here, I'm looking at you, Norway, but France also comes close to that. And in particular, well, for France, for Germany, these are two very large contributors in terms of absolute figures. They contribute, more than their fair share, and that amounts to about 10 billion. But, and here again, I'd like to underline, we're in 2021, so 1 year after the target should have been met. We still have countries, and that's about 7 countries, that provide less than half of what they should pay. So these are the countries that are in orange and red. And this is where I like to draw your attention to a subset of those countries. Next slide, please. So the United States is only paying about 21% of what it should pay. And then there is a bunch of other countries, Australia, Spain, Canada, Italy, and UK, who are not paying enough. But I wanted to draw your attention on those particular countries because I know that Greece, for example, is at the very bottom of the league table, but actually should only provide 0.6 billion more on top of what it should provide. Whereas for this subset of countries, and next slide, please, the absolute amount that they should contribute on top of the current provision is much, much larger. So this is like a visual way of representing how much more should each country provide. So the US should provide 34 billion more. whereas Australia, Canada, Spain, and the UK should each provide 2 billion more. So that is to say that in our advocacy efforts, of course, we should not celebrate, countries who are not delivering on their fair share, but some really should be the focus of our efforts because they are the ones who are the most responsible for the shortfall. And now if we can look at the next slide, we are going to turn to adaptation finance. So again, we assume that 40 billion is our quantitative target. And again, happy to discuss that if that's the appropriate amount, because as Koche was saying, this is far from meeting the needs. But so we have 11 countries that are providing their fair share of adaptation finance in 2021, noting that 2021 is the first year or perhaps the year just before, again, there is this like leeway in understanding when does the target, start effectively. So it could seem, quite encouraging that quite a few countries actually meet their fair share. And we still have, of course, the US that is at the very bottom, paying only 21% of what it should. And again, we have, and next slide, please, this set of countries which are the most responsible in absolute terms for the shortfall in adaptation finance. But here what is striking is that Australia, Canada, the UK, they are all part of the champion group on adaptation finance. So there is this very obvious disconnect between intention, between what is being said in, the climate arena where everyone is performing in a certain way, but then they actually don't deliver. So that can be an obvious focus on, where should we concentrate our efforts? And then next slide, please. I wanted to end with, and it's been brilliantly put before, but on these issues of beyond the focus on the quantum and, beyond focusing on the laggards, the ones who are not providing, there are two main issues around quality and accountability. So one around quality is that the data I presented accounts for loans at face value. So what it means is that countries are lending. Some of what they provide is actually in the form of loans. So that means that they recover part of the money that they lend. So it's not given, it's lent. And the problem is that adds to the debt burden of developing countries that are already pressed for their domestic fiscal space. And so what it means for the data that I presented is that should all the finance be accounted on a grant equivalence base, all countries would be making less progress towards paying their fair share. And then there is the access to the finance, which is not reflected in the data, right? But it's extremely time consuming. It's human resources intensive. And that is another inequity, another issue that adds up. And last, on accountability, I mean, we can ask a lot. And again, this is towards all countries, not just to the one who are in orange or red. But there is a need for greater transparency in the reporting. So that touches back on the issue of grants versus loans. But it's also about timely reporting. Why do we have data on 2021 only? Really, we are, entering negotiations for a new goal. And I know that Colin will talk about it in greater detail, but we can't be working with data that's still dating, that's still lagging. And then there is this issue of effectiveness. Yes, we all agree on, the importance of greater finance, but what for? And this is an accountability issue, because we want to know, if there is X provision, what does it mean in terms of effectiveness, in terms of locally led adaptation? It's particularly critical. And I know that Jackson will touch on this very important topic. So I'll stop there, and I really look forward to the Q&A and discussing this all together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Laetitia, for the great and comprehensive overview of the report, but also for the brilliant work that you and the team have done. And again, for the attendees, there will be a possibility to ask questions about the report. So do write those in the chats. And whilst the report assesses the state of climate finance, Colin will now look into where climate finance should be going. So over to you, Colin.
Thanks, Salome, and thanks, Koos and Letitia, for the excellent presentations, which actually has made my session a little easier. So yeah, I'm Colin McQuiston. I'm the head of climate and resilience at Practical Action. I've been a member of the Zurich Alliance since its outset in 2013, and I've been following the climate negotiations since COP20 in Peru, in Lima. So first slide, please. So this slide really just highlights the challenge of the 100 billion and put it really into context, because the 100 billion, we've got to remember, was a figure that came up from 2009 COP in Copenhagen, where the developed countries came together and sort of said, how much could we provide to drive climate action? And the 100 billion was literally plucked out of the air. It wasn't really based upon any evaluation of needs. It wasn't really based upon how they could see their development programs growing over time. It wasn't based upon how much do we need for climate versus how much do we need for other global problems. So the 100 billion was literally a promise from the donor community to the developing world to drive climate action. And, you know, there have been a number of studies recently which have really put this into perspective. And I think these two that I highlight on the slide, the first one is, you know, the total costs to shift the energy system of the planet from a fossil fuel dependent system to a renewable dependent system would cost about $62 trillion US, or I think it was mentioned earlier in the presentation, you know, a couple of trillion a year over the foreseeable future. Now, that is dwarfed, you know, that dwarfs the 100 billion promised that, you know, we had at Copenhagen. The second one is, of course, the fact that we are failing to mitigate the climate emergency means that climate impacts are escalating around the world. And a study of a couple of years ago highlighted that, you know, the costs of irreversible climate impacts, loss and damage, is between 290 to 580 billion a year by 2030, and is only going to get bigger. And therefore, one of the things that I want to highlight in the report and in the, you know, the thinking about 100 billion is the 40 billion figure really isn't realistic and is something that we need to be reviewing. And I will talk a little bit about this in my final slide. So next slide, please. So I think, as has already been highlighted, one of the issues around 100 billion is the quality of the funding. It's not just about the delivery of adaptation finance, but how that adaptation finance is being delivered. And I think a couple of the things that we need to really think about as we look ahead to what an appropriate level of adaptation finance should look like will also include a need to think about quality. And I think the first thing is we need to be thinking about adaptation finance, not from the perspective of how much donor countries are prepared to contribute, but how much we need to generate. What is the actual need on the ground to drive adaptation to really respond to the climate emergency? So it needs to be a needs-based number. And the UNEP adaptation report has already been highlighted is a good place to start to actually come up with that what that number looks like. And of course, we've got the IPCC report as a good way of tracking whether we're actually meeting the needs of those people on the ground. And of course, that links into this global stocktake, which is something else I'll talk about in my final slide. The second thing is the quality of finance from a loans perspective. And we've already talked about the fact that a lot of climate finance is actually generating stress in countries that have limited financial capacity, and they're having to service loans as well as meet their development needs, as well as respond to the climate, as well as provide education, infrastructure, health, etc., etc. So really, we need to be looking at climate finance that is grant equivalent at the very least, or ideally is grant based. We also need to be aware that, you know, the climate emergency is not removing the need for investment in education and infrastructure and governance and gender in the global south, and therefore it shouldn't be in place of development finance. It should be additional to development finance. It doesn't take away the need for the long-standing official development assistance that has been flowing to these countries being turned off as it's been replaced by climate finance. And then finally, this point on better tracking, so that we know what we're spending, we know where the money is going, and then we can better track whether it's having the impact that we need. So next slide. So yes, looking ahead. So we've had the new collective quantified goal already mentioned, and the new collective quantified goal will be the climate finance target from 2025 onwards, and we're halfway through the negotiations for that. Sadly, the negotiations are really at the point of the process and how the discussions will take place, and have not really got down into the nitty-gritty of what the quantum would look like, how the quantum would be divided, whether there would be targets for mitigation, for adaptation, for loss and damage, and whether there would be any sort of distribution mechanism that funding would go to specific sectors or geographies, etc., etc. So all of that is still to be discussed in the coming 12 months. But what we need to be bearing in mind that the new collective quantified goal is certainly going to be complicated by the discussions around loss and damage. So at COP27, there was the landmark decision to establish a loss and damage fund. And of course, the loss and damage fund is not part of the NCQG discussions at the moment. Whether it should be negotiated separately is still all to be played for. But we need to be looking at loss and damage finance as part of the overall package of climate finance, and therefore there needs to be considerations of that within the discussions for the new collective quantified goal. I think another core commitment is the new collective quantified goal needs to be public climate finance, and it needs to be from developed to developing countries in accordance with the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. That the global community has a responsibility to support countries to implement the mitigation, adaptation, and respond to address loss and damage that is occurring as a result of our failure to tackle the climate emergency. There are, of course, going to be a few very political issues that also need to be discussed. One of them is this idea of broadening the contributor base. We already have this sort of terminology within the climate space around people, the contributions based upon what can be contributed, but there isn't really any clear clarity on who should be contributing and what the level of contribution should be. And I think the Fair Shares report goes a long way in giving us some suggestions of how that might be done. Other issues, it would certainly help us if we had better tracking of where funding is coming from. But of course, that tracking needs to cover not just the public finance, but also private sector finance, because one of the promises of the Paris Agreement is this idea that more of global investment would be climate smart, would be aligned with our climate objectives, and therefore the private sector and financial sectors have a key role to play in shifting the global economy to respond to the climate emergency. And then finally, we have at COP27 coming up in Dubai at the end of the year, very much the discussion around the global stocktake. The global stocktake is the ratchet mechanism to ensure that we're on track to keep 1.5 degrees alive, although I suspect quite a lot of people on our webinar today would actually say, well, that's not really a realistic target anymore. But we need to be able to understand where we are in terms of our progress on delivering climate action. And therefore, I think for donor countries, for developed countries, they should be indicating in their NDCs what their commitment to climate finance is, ideally breaking that down maybe into pots, so that we can have better tracking of whether commitments are being met and whether those commitments are delivering the action that we really need. So I'm looking forward to the discussions at the end. I will hand over to the realities of climate impact in one of the Alliance countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colin. And indeed, there is still a long way ahead, and hoping that COP28 will make some headway on this topic, which is way too often fueling tensions around the negotiating table. So that now leads us to Jackson, who will contextualize the discussion we've been having and explore what the concrete impacts of a lack of climate finance is in Kenya. Over to you, Jackson.
Thanks, Salome, and thanks, Colleen, and my fellow co-presenters on the fruitful conversation we're having. So for me, I'll go into the context of Kenya. Kenya is a country in the East African region. Kenya is majorly an arid country with only 20% of our land that is considered productive. However, it does not mean that the 80% of land is not productive. It's because it lacks the investment, especially in water, to develop the key infrastructure around agriculture. We are faced by a number of cyclic shocks. I can say for the last 6 or so years, we have had drought, pests and diseases. We expect flooding in the coming 2 months, and the cycle will continue over a period of time. We have our own internal climate priorities. Majorly, they are around adaptation, things around disaster risk reduction, how we work around our agriculture, especially conservation agriculture, climate smart agriculture, our tourism, which is one of the greatest contributors of foreign investments, food security and nutrition. We're still a developing country and we have challenges around food security and of course health and sanitation. Next slide, please. So I will try to compare the discussion we are having and how that relates into Kenya. In Kenya, we have huge investments so far, not of course to the level in terms of finances, but at least we can track some of the investments we are having. As we can see, most of these investments currently is going to mitigation. And for mitigation, I mean, most of it is skewed towards renewable energy. Kenya uses its energy from 80% of its renewable sources. So at least to that extent, we are okay. However, these investments are disproportionate and they don't trickle down to the communities that need them most, the people who suffer from the challenges of climate change. As you can see, the investments come from various donors. We have government investments, in-country investments, but of course, the total of the in-country investments are below even the 50% threshold. And as you understand how government works, that the investment comes from the people, that's the taxes. And the other funding from bilateral donors, multilateral donors, the international community, international investors, as we said, is mostly in loans. And these loans have to be paid back. And the ratios are very high. And for international investors, for this matter, they have the business case. They're coming to invest in especially renewable energy because they can get an outcome out of it, and that is maybe profit. Next slide. So what is the cost of reduced investment and adaptation in country? Given that we are seeing very minimal investment in climate-friendly agriculture, which is our driver of our economy, the land use practices, the forestry, disaster risk management within country, watershed management, we have huge land that has a huge potential, but the investments are very poor. This leads us to have this very low food security. So we're seeing very high cases of food insecurity, malnutrition levels. You're talking in upwards of 30% of the children in country are malnourished, either stunting, undernourished, and the like. This leads to future, of course, reduced social and economic indicators. We're seeing a degraded environment over time. We are seeing devastating drought effects, floods, diseases, and of course, the cycle continues. And for this sake, I can say that Kenya as a country, of course, having been practiced agriculture as one of the biggest contributors of the economy, then we know that agriculture contributes is the highest contributor of the greenhouse gases emissions. However, the investments does not even translate to that. So the cycle will continue and continue on. So unless we have better investment within the adaptation space. Next slide. So this last slide is just to demonstrate what is the cost to the communities in the arid areas. And I'll read a quote from a community member in a county up north called Marsabit County. And the quote reads, "I've never seen a drought like this before. It has persisted for over 5 seasons, causing water sources we never imagined would run dry to do just that. This has resulted in significant loss of livestock, which is our sole means of sustenance. We try to take our livestock to the grazing fields. Unfortunately, we returned home with nothing. No livestock, no livelihoods." This is a cry from Lobe Kulatu, a resident of my corner in Marsabit County. And that is a cry for the people of Kenya who feel the heat of limited investment in climate change adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jackson, for your presentation. It really is a key reminder of the importance of having enough, but also to have better quality of climate and adaptation finance to support countries that are bearing the brunt of climate change. And now, as promised, we'll open the floor for some questions. We've received quite a few already, notably on the quality of climate finance. So one of them was, what is the biggest obstacle to increasing the proportion of climate finance that goes towards adaptation? And I don't know if one of the panelists wants to take this one.
Shall I perhaps give a few pointers and then others can jump in? It is a very, well, as Jackson was just showing, it is a striking point that adaptation finance has been underfunded. I guess the issue often with adaptation finance is that it's considered as a public good, and so hence with lower return profiles, so can't mobilize private finance as much, can't get loans as much. I guess this is where this issue of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities, but also of equity in and trust in the climate regime comes really to a very hard crucial point. So I think in this sense it's about the solidarity of what countries can pledge, and also about developing new models of finance. And while I may not have, all the answers to what these models can look like, we know that there can be, mobilization of private finance for certain type of adaptation measures. I'm thinking of, for example, desalination plants. So it is clearly a question of solidarity. But as one of the comments was saying, we are living in a more and more right-wing populist era, and that is proving more and more difficult to use as a discourse tool to get to greater pledges. So that is an issue.
Thank you, Leticia. Does anyone else want to jump in on climate adaptation finance?
Happy to.
Yeah, go ahead, Colin.
I think the other problem with adaptation finance is evidence that it's delivering on adaptation, and therefore we have this challenge that often a business case has got to be submitted. So it's mirroring the logic and the ideology behind mitigation finance, which is prove to us the greenhouse gas emissions per dollar invested, bang for the buck. Well, with adaptation, that is not a good way to proceed to then decide on adaptation projects. But we have that locked into things like the Green Climate Fund, this idea of coming up with a business case. And therefore, what we're getting a lot of adaptation that have co-benefits. So they can prove the mitigation benefits as a proxy for then trying to persuade donors to invest in adaptation, which again is not the most sensible thing to do, because when we're looking at those mitigation or boosting those mitigation benefits, we might actually not be doing the best adaptation actions that need to be done on the ground for those communities. So I think, as part of the discussions around the new collective quantified goal, we've got to come up with a better framing of what effective adaptation looks like and how that can be proven, so that donors can start shifting funding towards delivering adaptation on the ground, and particularly adaptation that reaches the communities on the front line of the climate emergency. And again, that is a fundamental challenge, because mitigation investment is around energy systems, it's around renewables, it tends to be slightly higher up the sort of governance structure, whereas adaptation really does need to meet those who are impacted by the climate emergency. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Colin. Yeah, indeed. And another question that has come up a few times already in the registration is, why are other big polluters not included in the report and not part of the contributors to the 100 billion target, notably China, but others? I don't know if anyone has thoughts on this.
Can I take that one? Oh, Leticia, you go first. You go first.
I was going to say, excellent question. We thought about this in our report last year, specifically because it's a question that comes time and time again in terms of who should contribute. And what our analysis showed is that it's countries like Qatar, like Singapore, Israel, and South Korea, who, you know, given their emissions, GNI and population, should be stepping up on their provision. But that said, all countries actually do contribute climate finance through, you know, their contributions to MDBs and to some extent to MCF. So China, for example, does contribute climate finance. It's just it does not report it because these are countries that do not want to be held accountable under the UNFCCC system because of this common but differentiated responsibilities principle that was agreed back in '92. So that was to say, yes, China is already providing, but actually, if we're looking for, you know, the ones who most pressingly should be contributing and reporting, it should probably be South Korea, Qatar, Singapore, Israel, and I would refer you to the last year's report that I already put the link in the chat. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
So
And,
much, yeah.
and if I could just add to that, I mean, I think that's right. And I think we need to remember that this goal was agreed in 2009, at which point it really was the existing Annex II countries that had the historical weight of the weight of responsibility for the emissions. They do, and they retain that high historical responsibility. And it's primarily the inaction of these countries since the UNFCCC was formed in 1992 to reduce their own emissions and to support the rest of the world in mitigation, just transition and adaptation that leaves us where we are right now. So there is a reasonable argument for considering widening the contributor base for the future goal, the NCQG, but it's hard to justify widening that at the moment in terms of this 100 billion target because it was agreed at a different time. And I think just one point on China, I think some of the developed countries love pointing the finger at China. And it's true that their emissions have gone up quite significantly in the last few years. But China's per capita income and per capita territorial cumulative emissions since the 1990s fall below any Annex II countries. So I think we need to keep this in context. Yes, there's potentially a role for China in the future, but I think for the 100 billion goal, I think we need to keep it very firmly on the countries that have already committed to achieving this. Thank you.
Thank you both. Yeah, and agree. These are discussions that are already fueling tensions around the upcoming NCQG, and that will hopefully be sorted by COP29. And we have also received more question on the quality of climate finance, notably as to whether the report looks into does the report look into gender and the principles of locally led adaptation when assessing countries' fashions of adaptation finance. Is this something that is included? Maybe for you, Laetitia.
I was going to be very proud and announce that we are looking into the gender objectives of climate finance. And that is something that will be available before COP this year, so that we can track how much has been within adaptation finance, how much has been going towards gender objectives, so that we can open that can of worm that are like gender mainstreaming markers as per the OECD rules. So hopefully we can have another discussion around that. As to the grant and loans equivalents, I think we all touch on these different points with our different angle and lenses. And I guess for the NCQG, what it means is having like some very strong rules on how these are reported so that we can have accurate counting of those.
Thank you, Laetitia. And indeed, really looking forward to the next piece that will be written on gender. One last question that we've received, and I know you touched upon that, Colin, a bit already, is around what the role of the private sector is and what it should be in contributing to in supporting the climate finance targets, as well as innovative sources of finance. Is that something you want to react to, or anyone else?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm happy to sort of kick off. I mean, basically, there's no point having climate finance separate from other international finance flows and investment more broadly. What we need to make sure is that all investments are driving climate compatible development, whether that's new energy systems, actions to respond or develop, say, the agricultural sector, that is done in a way that is intrinsically supporting adaptation, building new water systems that are thinking about future water supplies and also water supply needs, as has been highlighted by Jackson. You know, one of the things about the Kenyan agricultural system is 80% of the land is not productive, not because it's not potentially productive, but because there is no reliable irrigation that can be provided. So, you know, we need to be thinking about not just the climate finance consequences, but also the consequences of those bigger finance flows that are taking place at national and local levels. And of course, the private sector is fundamental to that. So really looking at how the private sector can meet its business needs while delivering that in a way which is sustainable from an environmental perspective. So it's not adding to the climate emergency, it's not degrading biodiversity or having impacts on natural systems. It's also supporting maybe local social systems. We need to be thinking about the social consequences, supporting gender empowerment, etc., and isn't reinforcing, you know, bad governance at the same time. So, you know, there are initiatives like the ESG, the environmental, social, and governance principles for investment, for sustainable investment. We need more of those types of initiatives taking place so that we can influence more private sector investment to be aligned and driving our climate agenda. But that doesn't deflect away from the responsibility of the developed countries to support climate action in developing countries. All of the NDCs indicate, you know, what is conditional, what is unconditional, what they're going to deliver anyway, regardless of global commitments. But then the conditional components of the NDCs are fundamental. And, you know, when you look at the conditional requirements of developing countries for adaptation and for mitigation, the donor, the 100 billion, you know, fails into insignificance. It's a very, very small amount based upon what is actually needed. Yeah, so we need to be looking at more private sector investment. And of course, my final comment would be around, of course, there are certain sectors which could be contributing a greater deal, and that to me would be the fossil fuel sector. You know, we're looking in Europe at the moment at phenomenally high profits for fossil fuel companies. And that money is not being returned, is not being used to invest in the transition to a renewable energy system, and it's not being invested in adaptation in developing countries, but it could go a long way. And I think there was a recent Oxfam report that indicated just in the UK, if we were to shift subsidies to fossil fuels, we could generate 30-odd billion of additional climate finance that could be used to invest in the transition to a more sustainable future. So yes, the private sector definitely has a role to play. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Colin. And indeed, there have been many calls for pushing for more innovative sources of finance, and hopefully these are discussions that will continue at the next COP and the one thereafter. Does anyone want to jump in before we head, unfortunately, into the closing remarks? Well, has any other comments?
If I may just add one thing to what you just said, and sorry, Salome, I think it's not so easy, especially when you talk about adaptation. It's not so easy to unlock the much needed private funding. But I think also here collaboration is key. I think, for example, the multilateral institutions can play a role to lead the way for the private sector, so to say. So, for example, by we have this GEMS database about the risks of investing in emerging markets and developing countries, for example. By sharing this database, it can help the private sector to jump in, as the perceived risks by the private sector can sometimes be a barrier for them to invest. And also development banks, for example, can catalyze institutional capital, for example, such as pension funds, and allowing also the private sector to participate in their investments. And in the Netherlands, we do have quite an interesting example We have the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development, the DFCD, which is collaboration of a financial partner, FMO, the bank, and the climate fund managers, and they've teamed up with development organizations such as SNV and the World Wildlife Fund, and together they are mobilizing private finance for like lots of local projects and helping them just to bring it to scale as well. And so I think it is possible, but it requires some creativity and partnerships to make it happen.
Great. Thank you so much, Kosha. And indeed, it is really key to increase the risk appetite from some donors, especially from the private sector. And there are many ways to do so. And actually, Mexico will be publishing a policy brief shortly on this very topic. Unfortunately, I have to hand over to Debbie to provide the closing remarks as we head to the end of the hour. So over to you, Debbie.
Thank you. And yeah, I've got the hard job of summing up some of the key points, because I think it's been fabulous, and it's been so good to hear perspectives from so many different people. So I think, how can I sum this up? I think we've talked about the quantity of climate finance, and that's really the basis of the ODI report, but also recognizing that quality piece as well. And I just wanted to add something on loans. I think, as you know, this analysis hasn't looked specifically at the loans issue, but other analyses have done this. And we know that donors much prefer to provide loans because it costs them very little. It's much easier to provide loans than grants. And I think the latest data we have is that 26% of reported public climate finance was provided as grants, only 26%. So the vast majority is in loans, and that's true of adaptation and funding in Africa, where more than half, so 54% of adaptation finance to Africa was in loans. And we know that that is fundamentally unjust, as developing countries are paying the vast majority of this back. So this issue of loans and grants is such a key one, and something that we really need to take into the NCQG and really make sure that loans are accounted for properly. We haven't really spoken much about where the climate finance goes, and you'll be surprised to know that how little of it actually goes to the most climate vulnerable countries. And particularly, there's a big gap in terms of climate finance to fragile states, who get very little climate finance overall. And so mostly because of the risk appetite of donors and multilateral climate funds. So the states and the affected communities within them are effectively marginalised because they're too difficult to support. So very happy that the UAE is taking on this issue for this COP, and we look forward to more progress on that front. And again, just to repeat what's been said before, that the failure to meet these targets is really undermining, particularly the 100 billion, is really undermining trust in the whole COP process. It's really creating mistrust that is going to make this COP and future COPs even more difficult. So really need more pressure on donors to be reaching their commitments. And it's been said by, I think, probably everyone, that even if these goals are being met, then these goals are not being based on needs, and their needs are much, much greater. So really looking for the NCQG to reflect that. And yeah, so at this COP, then what are we looking for? I think we're looking to developed countries to recommit with realistic plans and new funding commitments to achieve their existing commitments of 100 billion and 40 billion. And we want to start to hear some language and commitments in their statements about going beyond those 140 targets in preparation for the NCQG. And in particular, that closing the adaptation finance gap requires more than 40 billion or doubling of adaptation finance. So I hope this has been a useful and interesting session, and that civil society will continue to hold developed countries to account for their commitments and keep on pushing for climate finance that's more in line with needs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Debbie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Once again, as everyone mentioned, increasing the quantity and improving the quality of climate finance is key in the fight against climate change, and I cannot stress the importance of the discussion we're having today and of the broader discussion again. So on this note, thank you again. I will let you go back to your day, and I hope to see you again very soon. Bye, everyone.